Picture a parking lot at 7 a.m., the kind you've seen 1,000 times. Rows of cars catching the early light. SUVs, trucks, sedans, and somewhere in that lot, almost certainly, there's a Honda Civic. Not the newest model, not the oldest. Just there. Clean. Reliable. Quietly present in a way that somehow feels intentional. The person who owns it isn't thinking about their car right now. They're thinking about their morning, their coffee, their day. The Civic is simply an extension of that, a tool, they'd say if you asked. Just a car. Practical. Gets the job done. And they believe that completely. But watch them for a moment longer. Notice how they close the door, not with carelessness, not with pride, but with a particular kind of quiet satisfaction. Not, look at what I have. More like everything is where it should be. That small gesture tells you more about them than any personality test ever could. There's a type of person who moves through life without needing the world to notice them, not because they lack ambition, not because they've given up on anything, but because their sense of self isn't built on external confirmation. They don't need the car to speak for them. They don't need the logo, the badge, the statement. They already know who they are. Or at least, that's the story they tell themselves. And this is where it gets interesting. Because the Honda Civic isn't just a practical choice. It never really was. Every car choice is a psychological act. We tell ourselves it's about mileage, maintenance costs, resale value, and those things are real. But underneath the logic, always, without exception, there is identity. The question is, what kind of identity does the Civic protect? Think about the psychology of restraint. Not deprivation, not limitation, restraint, the conscious, deliberate choice to not perform, to not signal, to step back from the cultural noise that tells you your worth is visible, measurable, and parked in your driveway. Most people don't realize how much energy goes into that choice, how much cultural pressure exists to consume upward, to treat every purchase as a statement of arrival. The bigger truck, the luxury badge, the car that says, "I've made it." Civic owners, in general, don't speak that language. And what's fascinating is that this refusal isn't passive. It's not that they couldn't learn the language. It's that somewhere along the way, consciously or not, they decided it wasn't worth speaking. That's a psychological stance. And it shapes everything. There's a concept in psychology around locus of control. The degree to which a person believes their life is directed by internal values versus external forces. People with a strong internal locus of control tend to make decisions based on their own framework, not the framework handed to them by culture, status, or social comparison. You see this in Civic owners in subtle ways. They're often the person at work who does the job well without campaigning for recognition, the friend who gives advice that's genuinely useful rather than flattering, the individual who can sit in an unimpressive apartment with expensive books and feels zero contradiction in that. Their self-esteem doesn't require a stage. But here's the layer beneath that, and this is what most people miss entirely. The choice to appear ordinary takes a certain kind of confidence that looks from the outside like modesty, but it isn't modesty. Modesty implies diminishment. This is something else entirely. It's the confidence of someone who has quietly decided that they don't need to win the visual game, that they're playing a different game altogether, a longer one, a slower one where the scoreboard isn't visible to anyone else. And in a world absolutely saturated with performance, where everything from breakfast to evening routines is curated for an audience, that is a radical psychological position to hold. The Civic becomes, in this light, not a symbol of settling. It becomes a symbol of selectivity. But wait, before we make this too clean, too flattering, there's something else underneath. Because not every Civic owner has made peace with this choice in the way I've just described. Some of them are still negotiating it. There's a particular quiet that sometimes lives inside practical people, a voice that shows up in parking lots, at traffic lights, in the brief moment when a sharper, louder car pulls up beside them. A voice that doesn't say anything dramatic, just something like, "Is this enough?" Not loud enough to be a crisis, not honest enough to be a conversation, just a flicker, a half second of something unnamed, and then the light changes, and they drive on. That internal negotiation, barely conscious, rarely spoken, is where the real psychology begins. Because the Honda Civic doesn't just tell you something about practicality or restraint or internal values. It sits at the intersection of who someone has decided to be and who they're still figuring out they are. And that tension, that quiet, unresolved space between identity chosen and identity felt, that's what we're really talking about. Before we go deeper, I want to ask you something. That feeling I just described, that quiet negotiation happening inside someone who looks, from the outside, completely settled. Have you lived inside that feeling? Not about a car, about anything, a job you stayed in, a life you built, a version of yourself you committed to. Drop it in the comments, just one line, because what comes next is going to land very differently if you have. We left off at a flicker, that half second at the traffic light, the unnamed something, the voice that doesn't quite speak but doesn't fully disappear either. Most people who own a Civic have felt it at least once, and most of them, almost immediately, talk themselves out of it, rationally, efficiently, the way they do most things. It's just a car. It runs perfectly. The payment is manageable. I have other priorities. And every single one of those things is true, but the speed at which they arrive, the readiness of that rational response, that's the tell. Because people who are truly at peace with a decision don't need to defend it, even to themselves. Not that quickly, not that automatically. The defense mechanism reveals something the logic was trying to cover. There's a particular psychological type that gravitates toward the Civic. Not universally, nothing in human behavior is universal, but consistently enough to be worth examining. They are, more often than not, disciplined people. Not in the performative sense. Not the person who posts their 5 a.m. workout or tracks every calorie in a color-coded spreadsheet. The quieter kind of discipline, the kind that operates mostly invisibly, in the decisions they don't make, the things they don't buy, the reactions they choose not to have. This is discipline as identity, as internal architecture, and it's genuinely impressive. The ability to delay gratification, to resist the pull of the immediate, to build a life around function rather than feeling. These are not small things. Psychologically speaking, they correlate with stability, with long-term planning, with a kind of groundedness that most people spend decades trying to achieve. So what's the shadow side? Because there is one. There always is. Discipline, when it becomes the foundation of identity rather than simply a tool, starts to quietly calcify. It stops being a choice and becomes a requirement. And requirements, even self-imposed ones, carry weight. For the deeply disciplined person, spontaneity starts to feel like your responsibility. Pleasure that isn't earned starts to feel like weakness. The occasional desire for something beautiful, not practical, not logical, just beautiful, gets filed quietly under unnecessary and set aside. And this is where the Civic becomes a genuinely complex symbol. Because for some owners, it isn't just a practical car. It's a daily confirmation of their discipline. A small, recurring proof that they haven't lost control, that they're still the person they decided to be, rational, grounded, unsentimental. Every morning they get in, every morning without fanfare, yes, still me. That kind of self-confirmation runs deeper than most people realize. There's a concept worth sitting with here, the idea that our possessions don't just reflect who we are, they regulate who we are. They become part of the system we use to stay consistent with our self-image. When that consistency feels threatened, by desire, by comparison, by that flicker at the traffic light, we lean into our anchors. The Civic, for these individuals, is an anchor. And anchors are not neutral objects. They hold you in place, which can mean stability. But it can also mean, depending on the person, depending on the moment, that you haven't moved in a while. Here's a micro story worth sitting with. Imagine someone, mid-30s, careful with money, good at their job. They've driven Civics for 12 years, not because they couldn't afford something different, because every time they genuinely considered it, the math didn't justify the upgrade, and the math was always right. But one evening, they're at a dinner party. Someone mentions their new car, not bragging, just mentioning it, and this person feels something shift slightly in their chest. Not envy, exactly, something more complicated. Something that sounds, if you listen carefully, like, I wonder what it would feel like to just want something and get it, without the math. They drive home that night in the Civic. The engine is quiet, the fuel economy is excellent, and somewhere between the highway and their driveway, the feeling passes. But it was real. And it mattered. That moment, that specific emotional texture, points towards something that sits at the core of the disciplined person's inner life. The fear of desire itself. Not fear of failure. Not fear of judgment. Fear of wanting. Because wanting, for someone who has built their identity around restraint, feels dangerously close to losing control. And control, real, structural, quiet control over impulse and image and outcome, is not just something they value. It is, in many ways, who they are. Take it away, even briefly, even in a parking lot or at a dinner table, and something fundamental feels unstable. And this is the part that makes Civic owners, the deeply disciplined ones, more emotionally complex than they tend to appear from the outside. They are often perceived as low maintenance, steady, easy to be around, and they are those things. But underneath that surface, there is frequently a person managing a great deal, managing the gap between what they feel and what they allow themselves to feel, between who they've decided to be and who they might be under different rules. The discipline is real, the groundedness is real, and so is the quiet cost of maintaining it. The Civic, then, is not just a reflection of practicality. It's a mirror for a particular kind of internal life, one where the outside is calm, the logic is sound, and the deepest feelings are handled competently, privately, and sometimes at the expense of ever being fully heard, even by themselves. There's a moment that almost every Civic owner has experienced. Someone, a coworker, a relative, a friend with slightly different priorities, glances at their car and says something like, "You should upgrade. You can probably afford something better by now." It's said casually, without malice, just a passing observation dressed as encouragement, and the Civic owner smiles, maybe laughs a little, says something practical in response. Something about reliability or depreciation or not caring about status symbols. The conversation moves on, but something in that exchange lingers, not the comment itself, something underneath it. A question that wasn't asked out loud but was felt clearly. Is the way I've chosen to live actually visible to anyone, or does it just look like I couldn't do better? This is where identity becomes genuinely fragile, not in a dramatic way, not in a way that shows, but in that specific private way where your internal narrative, the one you've built carefully, the one that makes sense of your choices, suddenly depends on whether other people can read it correctly. And the uncomfortable truth is, they usually can't. Restraint doesn't advertise itself. Discipline has no logo. The person who chose the Civic because they understand value, because they think in decades, not months, because they've genuinely moved past the need for external validation, that person and the person who drives a Civic because they simply couldn't afford otherwise, look from the outside exactly the same. That invisibility is either liberating or quietly maddening, sometimes both, depending on the day. There's a deep psychological tension that lives here. On one side, the genuine belief earned, considered, real, that self-worth doesn't require performance, that a quiet life, a functional car, a savings account growing steadily is its own kind of success. And this belief isn't self-deception. For many Civic owners, it is a mature, hard-won philosophy. On the other side, the very human need to be understood, not praised, not envied, just seen accurately, to have the internal logic of your choices reflected back to you by the world around you. When those two things conflict, and they do, regularly, in small moments, what emerges is a particular kind of loneliness that has nothing to do with relationships or social life. It's the loneliness of being consistently misread. Think about what it does to a person over time. Every "you should upgrade" lands not as an insult, but as a reminder that the meaning they've assigned to their own choices isn't legible to the people around them. That the story they've been telling themselves, "I chose this," deliberately, from a place of clarity, doesn't survive contact with casual outside perception, and so they double down, quietly. They become more certain of their logic, more articulate internally about why their choice is correct. The philosophy gets sharper, the reasoning gets cleaner. This is not growth, this is defense. And the thing about sophisticated defense mechanisms is that they feel from the inside indistinguishable from genuine conviction. There's a particular kind of person who has spent so long justifying their restraint that they've slowly lost access to the part of themselves that simply wants things, not needs, not values, just wants. The uncomplicated, slightly irrational, deeply human experience of desiring something, not because it makes sense, but because it's beautiful, or exciting, or because you saw it and something in you lit up before your brain had time to intervene. For the heavily rationalized Civic owner, that response doesn't disappear. But it gets processed so quickly, filtered through practicality, through identity, through the accumulated weight of every choice they've made to be this particular kind of person, that by the time it reaches the surface, it's already been converted into something manageable, something safe, something that doesn't cost them anything. And this is perhaps the quietest, most human part of this entire exploration, not the discipline, not the practicality, not even the loneliness of being misread. It's the gradual narrowing. The way a person can spend years making entirely reasonable choices and wake up one day to find that their life, functional, stable, logical, has been slowly shaped around the avoidance of feeling rather than the pursuit of it. Not unhappy, not lost, just precise, in a way that doesn't leave much room for surprise. The Honda Civic, in the end, is a perfect mirror for this. It is, genuinely, an excellent car. Reliable, efficient, honest in its engineering. There is real intelligence in choosing it, real clarity. But mirrors don't just show you what you want to see. They show you everything. And for some people, the Civic has quietly become the physical embodiment of a life philosophy that began as freedom, freedom from status, from performance, from the exhausting game of visible success, and slowly, without announcement, became its own kind of cage. Not a dramatic cage. A comfortable one, the kind you don't notice because everything inside it works perfectly. So the next time you see a Civic in a parking lot, clean, unremarkable, present in that particular quiet way, understand that you're not looking at a car, you're looking at a decision, layered over years, carried daily, defended occasionally, questioned privately. You're looking at someone who decided at some point that they knew exactly who they were. And the most interesting question isn't whether they were right, it's whether they ever let themselves find out. If you found yourself nodding at that quiet flicker in the parking lot, if you've ever wondered what our everyday choices really say about us, then this channel is built for you. Subscribe, because here we don't just look at what people drive. We look at why they drive it and what it costs them to keep choosing it.